Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the Future History Project. This is a series that I'm doing on sort of a biographical aspect of the writer Isaac Asimov. Last week, we left him at 12 years old, approximately, and that's where he's going to stay for a little while. Hey, this is science fiction. We can pause time for a while. Mostly that was taken from his first autobiographical book, In Memory Yet Green, the autobiography of Isaac Asimov, 1920 to 1954. It's a huge tome. It's over 700 pages, and there's a companion volume that goes from 54 to, I think, 74, 75. And it's done basically chronological, based on a lot on his like his his diaries and his memory and early genealogical information that was based on his father. And he does realize that he can't verify a lot of the material, and he does note the inconsistencies at times and omissions, especially regarding female members of his ancestry. But I found it very interesting. It's like, he writes with the usual clarity and humor. But I thought I'd pause a little bit because he did a third volume called I, Asimov, but it's a bit different. It doesn't sort of pick up where the second volume ends. It's more thematic, and he covers similar ground, but more of his thoughts, philosophy of life. And that's where I want to pick up this one, because there's some interesting aspects of that. And then also, like I was using this one here, Before the Golden Age, which has material from autobiographical material about his discovery of the stories that are in here, more or less. And then I popped into this one. This is an unauthorized biography, which is sort of a very watered down version of this. So far, anyway. I'm hoping it will pick up. And then I've also dipped into this. This was sort of the fourth one. This was done, put together by his widow, Janet Asimov. And it covers similar ground as the three volumes. However, it's kind of interesting. She pulls out stuff, and it makes it a bit uneven because she plucks stuff from the other three volumes, and then sort of strings it together with square brackets of her own, to try to make it a coherent narrative. But it, like I say, it's a bit uneven at times. But it also adds letters and other material, at least so far, and I think it'll continue through. So it's quite interesting. But the letters are mostly Isaac Asimov writing to her. So those are quite interesting that I'm doing. I just wanted to show something here because there's I didn't show it before because his parents obviously are important, and there are photos here. I think they're from the passports. His father up here at age 25, and his mother age 26. Basically at the time they left the Soviet Union. Or not so. Yeah, it was the Soviet Union when they did leave, yeah. And in the third volume, there's a picture of them later in life. His mother, and then his father, Judah, and his mother. And it goes to show what time and life does, just as an aside. But as I say, this volume deals more with his thoughts on things, and I'm going to pluck out a number of things that is touched on in the other volumes, definitely, but a little more meat on this one, and I'm calling it the 3 R's. It's racism, reading, and writing. And there's there's short chapters, and in the chapter 7 here, he's titled it Anti-Semitism. And he talks about he was fully conscious of being a Jew in America and from Russia, but he does point out that his family in the area that he was born in, the town, that there was no programs there, so Gentiles and Jews lived peacefully, and there were no problems, so they didn't have to escape Russia because of anti-Semitism. But he's fully aware that it was there, and it's in the U.S. And he realized growing up that there were doors barred to him because of being a Jew, but he accepted it, and so he made his own path. And the other things that I'm going to sort of quote from here is directly from Asimov, and I'm not in. I agree with some, and then I question a bit of other things, but I'm doing it from his point of view here. So these are things, and like he says, everything sort of came to like during the 30s with Hitler, obviously, and became to be known. But he feels that that being in America, that he was pretty stable, and that those kind of things would never happen, and the fascism wouldn't rear its ugly head. Yeah. And he always sort of felt this, that like he says, even though I, though Jewish and poor besides, eventually received a first-class American education at a top university, and I wondered how many African Americans would have the chance. It constantly bothered me to denounce anti-Semitism unless I denounced the cruelty of man to man in general. And he wound up on a TV show a panel, I think it was here, a panel with Eli Wiesel. And he sort of, I guess, this was in 1977, and he finally he said, broke out with this. And he sort of questioned, but also similar to the time, he said he was speaking a woman who grew eloquent over the terrible way in which Gentiles did nothing to save the Jews in Europe. You can't trust Gentiles, she said. I let some time elapse, then asked suddenly, what are you doing to help the blacks in their fight for civil rights? Listen, she said, I have my own troubles. And I said, so did the Gentiles. But she only stared at me blankly. She did not get the point at all. And then his sort of conclusion was, freedom is wonderful, but only for me. And that's the way the world seems to live under this banner, he thought. And he says, he broke out under difficult conditions in May of 1977. On that occasion, shared a platform with others, among them Eli Wiesel, who survived the Holocaust. And Wiesel, he said, irritated him because he said that he did not trust scientists and engineers because scientists and engineers had been involved in conducting the Holocaust. And he just thought, well, what a generalization. And he says, And then he says, it's precisely the sort of thing that anti-Semite says. He'll say something like, I don't trust Jews because once Jews crucified my Savior. And then finally, and then he said, Mr. Weissel, it is a mistake to think that because a group has suffered extreme persecution that is a sign that they are virtuous and innocent. They might be, of course, but the persecution process is no proof of that. The persecution merely shows that the persecuted group is weak. Had they been strong, then for all we know, they might have been the persecutors. And whereupon Weissel, got excited and said, give me one example of Jews ever persecuting anyone. And Asimov says, I was ready for that. And then, under the Maccabean kingdom of the 2nd century BC, John Hyrcanus of Judea conquered Edom and gave the Edomites a choice: conversion to Judaism or the sword. And the Edomites were sensible, and they converted to Judaism. And Weissel said, well, that's the only time that ever happened. And Asimov replied, well, that's the only time the Jews had power. 1 out of 1 isn't bad. And then he said he might have, added in things about, Israel and the Palestinians, but he didn't. And he had a similar argument, he says, with Avram Davidson, a brilliant science fiction writer who, of course, is Jewish and was, for a time, at least ostentatiously, Orthodox. And he sort of had a confrontation with them, and Davidson took the umbrage. Well, it's basically in response to an essay that he wrote about the Book of Ruth, and he took umbrage to the implication that the Jews were intolerant, and he wrote me a letter. He's saying that Davidson wrote him a letter, which waxed sarcastic indeed. He also asked when the Jews had ever persecuted anyone. And again, he had an answer. He says, and his answer was, apparently, Avram, you and I are Jews who live in a country that is 95% non-Jewish, and we are doing very well. I wonder how we would make out, Avram, if we were Gentiles and lived in a country that was 95% Orthodox Jewish. He said he never answered, and then he talks about Israel, but he also talks about, he goes on when he starts talking about in books and literature and pulp fiction at the time. And films, the racism to blacks, even to sexism to women. Women were just sort of playthings, and in science fiction they were sort of, they weren't really heroines, but they were had to be saved but from the evil person, and all this type of thing, and he even admits that when he started writing, he didn't have women in his stories, but he sort of learned. He also talks about that that ever since sort of the Second World War and Hitler, all this, what do you call he has used in different places, the casual racism or racism against blacks and other groups, Native Americans and so forth, it was acceptable before the Second World War, but it was then no longer acceptable after. And people thought it, but they couldn't verbally speak it. I'm not so sure about that, but that was his view. But yeah, and again, it would be interesting with the fascism part if he had lived over in the past, or been alive in the past decade, basically. Anyway, that sort of leads into his reading. Now, at 6 years old, we'd found out that his father saved up enough money to buy a candy store which had a lot of magazines, but his father wouldn't allow him to read what he called the trash in the magazines. There were, The Shadow, Doc Savage, and so forth. His father read The Shadow, and he used that as an example. Well, you do. He says, "Well, I have to learn English. You know it, and you have school, and you need to read good things." So, but Isaac was wanting to read, so they decided to get him a library card, and so his father never looked at the kind of material, because he figured everything was in the library was good. So Isaac had free run and to choose whatever he wants. He realizes that if his father was American or knew English well enough, he would have been able to help to guide him. But he wasn't. In America, he was he barely knew English, so he didn't know the culture or anything like that. Back in Russia, he knew the culture of the Bible and the Torah, and Jewish scholars. Not that he was overly religious, but that was sort of the thing to do, and he was educated in that way. But in America, it's less so. And he never sort of forced this on Isaac to learn either. Isaac did eventually learn a little bit of Hebrew, and then he could read Yiddish, but he never really kept up with it so much. So with the library, he was able to discover things. He was on his own, like he talks about that, because his parents, because of the candy store, was open from 6 a.m. to 1 a.m., that his father, slept 4 or 5 hours a night, and then had a nap in the afternoon. And Asimov says, yeah, like he didn't really have his parents on a normal home life, but he always knew where his parents were, and he was able to do things as long as they knew where he was. And a lot of time he had to be either at school or around the store, because he did errands. And then finally he worked heavily in there once his brother was born in 1928. But anyway, with the library card, sorry, you probably can hear noise outside. I'm doing this at nighttime, but they're digging up the street here again for the water. And I've been here for coming up to 6 years, and they do that about 2 or 3 times a year. So I do apologize for that. So back to Asimov in the library. He just sort of, he pulled and read various things, and he found books dealing with Greek myths. He realizes that he mispronounced all the Greek names, but he read the Iliad, and for a while he was just enchanted by it, and he read it over and over again, took it out so many times, and then he discovered fairy tales, and he wasn't quite sure whether they're real, but then when he did find out that they weren't real, and then, everything from the Bible sort of became, Hebrew fairy tales to him, or Hebrew mythology. And he got, he read Shakespeare. He also read other pulp stuff like these Eugene Sue. I should have had the book here, because he did read Mysteries of Paris, The Wandering Jew, and he loved that stuff. And like I say again, he loved the Greek history, and he realized that the fiction sort of led into history. Like he says, he couldn't read The Three Musketeers without wanting to know, or becoming curious about French history. And and he discovered Charles Dickens, um, all sorts. He says he became sort of an Anglophile because the library was chock a block full of 19th century English literature, and he figures he read most of that. And he says he could never, even as an adult, he couldn't quite comprehend a lot of times 20th century literature, but he did love certain things. He read nonfiction 20th century, and there were certain things like humor he loved. P.G. Wodehouse he loved, Agatha Christie he loved, and obviously science fiction and all that. And he loved The Shadow, and he eventually read that, and so and he finally because like with I just see here that Eugene Sue's Mysteries of Paris, and he was attracted by the word mysteries. So, and he loved the way it depicted the Paris underground, the criminality of Paris. And he figures that he was a bookworm, um, because he wasn't he was an extrovert, but he was isolated. He always thought he was an outsider, and it was various reasons that he couldn't at school, join in with the clubs because he had to get home, especially from 1928 onward, and he had to work at the store, and he um, he was out of sync with school as well because he was pushed ahead. So he was always like 2.5, and sometimes 3 years younger than his classmates, and he was disruptive, as well, in the sense that he would talk, and that wasn't allowed. So teachers didn't really care for him that much. He was at that time, before he went into high school, he was the smartest kid in the class, and most precocious. He went through all his textbooks, like once he got them, he read them all in the first week or so. So anything the teacher taught, he already knew because he had a very good memory for this, and he couldn't understand the other children that didn't memorize things, and they had to be told over and over. So there was a lot of boredom there as well. And then because he was at home and he had to be at the store, and then eventually looking after his brother, Lloyd, um, he couldn't play as much, and he couldn't interact, as I say, after school clubs and so forth. So he crawled into his books. And then at the time of 1928, when his mother gave birth and his father began relying on him more, he was fascinated to find out, because he started seeing the science fiction magazines, Amazing Stories, Hugo Gernsback's first magazine. But in 1928, he was ousted from there, and he started his own magazines like Science Wonder Stories and Air Wonder Stories. And he says he conned his father because of science, in these things, that he could read this and it'd be useful. So his father allowed him. So he made that little stride inward, and then after his mother gave birth, and that he was able to push further, and he started reading The Shadow, Doc Savage, and all sorts of stuff, and the boys' stories, the dime novels that were still sort of left around. But he could never keep any of this stuff, and that's the one thing he talked about. Because he had to read the magazines, and if there was only one of them, and if he was reading it while a customer wanted it, it was yanked out of his hand and sold. So he never finished it. But he said most of the time there were multiple copies, so mostly there were no problems, especially with the science fiction and like Doc Savvy and Shadow and so forth. And with the libraries, obviously he couldn't keep material. The family was too poor to buy books, and for him to keep. And then he thought on an idea that he got a notebook that he would just write out the stories, or get a book from the library and write it out, so he'd have a permanent record of it. And he quickly realized that, that was a fool's errand. He couldn't do that. And then, yeah, around 11 or 12, when he was 11 or 12 in like 1931, he decided to, write his own stories. And this sort of came about because of him. So he says, writing down things. So we're now segueing into writing. And, uh, prior to that, he had a friend named Saul that would tell him stories that he thought, Saul had made up these stories, and he was fascinated by this. But Saul moved away, and he never saw him again. And then once he started reading the science fiction magazines, he became a storyteller to other friends. But he started telling stories from the stories he read. And he remembers reading, and telling the world of the Red Sun, and then later he found out that it was Clifford Simak's first story. He'd sort of forgotten that until he was doing, this kind of thing of the pre-Golden Age material. And so, and they were enthralled. They were enthralled. So he decided, that, well, maybe I can make up my own story. And that's the way he sort of thought, well, if he can't write out other stories, he'll write his own. So he started writing a story, and he was sort of based on it because he saw the title of one. I'm trying to find out what it was. Well, anyway, it was like, chums that go to college, and he got quite a ways into it, but then he sort of ran out of steam because he didn't know where to go, and he didn't know what like happened in a chemistry lab and things like that. So he left that aside, but he did read it to someone, or he told the story, and the friend said, when you're finished with the book, I want to read it. So he realized that, hey, there was something there. I'm a writer. So he continued at times, but he always ran out of steam. And then while he was in high school, he took a creative writing course because the person who edited the school sort of newspaper was doing this. So he was so excited about this, he wrote an essay, and he got up in front of the class and started reading it, and the teacher sort of said, well, this is shit. And he never heard, anybody, in school say that word before, and he felt humiliated by it. And, and the class laughed at him and everything, because at the time he got into high school, he was still smart, but he wasn't quite maybe as smart as the other kids. And he thinks that it's because he never really studied. Because he didn't have time. He never really studied. He read and he listened to the teacher, and he was able to retain all this, but he never went further at that time for the studying. And then there was a contest that they wanted to have something in a publication at the university. I mean, at the high school, and his won, and the teacher. So he felt really good about it. But even in the editorial, the one says, well, the teacher sort of apologizes of putting something so poor in here, but he wanted an upbeat story. And Isaac's was the only upbeat story or essay that all the class put in. So he remembered that, and he just sort of, he with malice, basically. And he sort of had thought later in life, if he could go back in time, and show him his books and say, you were wrong and all this kind of stuff. And it was actually his first published story. And it was trying to see if I can remember what it was here. It was a school paper. It was called, it was called Little Brothers. And it's, he says it's sort of a collector's item now. because it's the first story, but it told him that he could write, and he enjoyed it, and he got over it. He figured out how, like, to not run out of steam for writing. He still makes up. He says he makes up the story as he goes along, but he's got a beginning and he's got the resolution, and then he writes as he's going, making it up as he's writing it, but he knows where it's going to end, and that's what saved him. And he's honed that over the years. He was able to incorporate other things like women into the stories. He is learned, but he says, he still feels that probably, there's still the pulp fiction aspect in his writing. You can still see it, and he apologizes for that, but he tries his best. But that was where, he, even though he read all this other stuff, like the literature, 19th century English literature, history, like, he was still interested in all this stuff, but he had the thirst to write, and to, he just had to write. And it was fiction, and it was that kind of pulp fiction that he wanted to do. And we speed ahead now to, like, his first selling of stories in 1939, 38, 39. We'll get into more of that later, but yeah, he and because he looks back and he says, because he spent the long hours in the store and away from people, he is perfectly comfortable to not leave his sort of his office and write. Like, he doesn't go anywhere. He doesn't really leave. Like, when he was writing this, he was living in Manhattan, and he says he's perfectly happy to not go anywhere and just sort of, tell his stories and write, and continually write. Even though, he his brother was a little different, but he came in later. So, and Isaac was always sort of more introverted in that way. He didn't like. He was awkward with people, I guess it is, and he sort of went inward and being very bookish because and people thought he was weird because he would, if he took 2 or 3 books out of the library, he said if he had 3 of them, he'd have one under one arm and one under the other arm, and then reading the other one walking down the street, and people would tell his parents that he was peculiar. So his parents scolded him for this because they didn't want him to be, call attention basically to things. But he just continued that way all through his life, So I found that kind of interesting. It's sort of like I say, the 3 R's, and there's other, like, his. I think we'll revisit this one many times with little bits and pieces, because he goes through and he talks about, like, his early sales, John W. Campbell, Heinlein, L. Sprague de Camp, Clifford Simak, so all sorts of stuff, little chapters. So I do want to, capture those separately above his, chronological biography, which will continue next week from here mostly. And I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any thoughts on anything, and I thought it was sort of appropriate to do that, where he, telling about his background, his love of books, because I really think, because I've read quite a bit of his fiction, and I think you could see this in his fiction. You can see this in the fiction, and the sense of wonder, living inside his his own head with the stories, and I just found it fascinating. And it was at the encouragement of his wife Janet in the way to write this, because he was going to just continue on a 3rd volume chronologically up until the 1990s, but he was quite ill. Like, he was in his late 70s when when yeah, 70 some, and his wife said, you should do this, but do it in a different way. And so he did. And they're sort of little thought pieces, little essays in some ways, you could say. And this is going to be, I thought I had read this before, but once I started reading it now, I realized I had not read this volume. I had read the other two, but I had not read this one. So it'll be nice sort of flipping back and forth, and especially with this one here, the fourth volume that she put out posthumously. It'll be nice to see the little interpolations that she puts in, as well as the letters and a few other things. So anyway, I'll let you go there, BookTube, and I hope you're enjoying your week has got off to a good start, and I hope you're enjoying the Future History Project. Take care, BookTube.